Yo, what's happening people, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be going over some tips that you can use to increase your workflow inside of Ableton Live. A lot of these tips can be transferred over to other DAWs, however, today I'm just going to be showcasing them inside of Ableton. If you're new around here, then please consider hitting the subscribe button and click the bell next to it too so you can be notified every time I drop new content. So with all that said, let's get straight into it. So I've been producing for a good few years now, and over that time I've realised that having a good workflow is one of the most important things to lock down in order to work in a truly efficient way. I look back on the way that I used to start my old projects and I can't believe that I was happy to just use Ableton's stock live set. The amount of time that you're going to spend adding instruments, naming tracks, adding effects, making groups, alongside a load of other things is really going to add up across a whole day of making music. So the first tip I'm going to show you is how you can make your own default live set. So I know that whenever I start working on a track in Ableton, I'm always going to want one group for my melodic elements, one group for my drums, and then one group for my low end instruments. So rather than going through adding instruments and then later having to add them to a group, I've got my live set to automatically open with these groups already made for me. Now you can go an extra step with this tip and you can add some preloaded instruments onto these tracks. However, for me, I find myself making that many genres of music that this will be counterproductive for me. Then once you're happy with the way everything is, you can come to File and click on Save Live Set as Default Template, give it a name, and now every time you open Ableton, this is the template that you're going to have. If you want to download this basic group template, then I'm going to leave a link so you can do so in the description, and you can tweak this template for yourself and make it work for your workflow. This next tip actually saves me so much time, and it's something so simple. When I figured it out, I was like, shit man, what have I been doing? So I'm not too sure about you, but every time I'm making a track, I find myself adding an EQ to every single track in some way or another. Whether that's for creative purposes in the writing stage or whether it's later on in the mixing stage, I find myself loading EQs on most of my tracks. So I like to just make sure that all of my tracks are already armed with an EQ, and I also like to add this utility plugin to manage gain before any of the sounds go to the mixer. But this tip is going to work for any effects that you find yourself using all of the time. So I know that even if the track that I'm working on doesn't need too much EQ in, I'm going to want to roll off everything below 20 Hz. So I've just put this EQ back to its stock setting, and now I'm going to go back in and add my roll off at 20 Hz. What I can then do is come up to the top of the EQ, right click and save this as the default preset. Now anytime that I add an EQ to a track, it's automatically going to have that 20 Hz rolled off. Now similar to the last trick, this trick is going to show you how to save a default instance for a MIDI or audio track. So like I mentioned earlier, I like to arm each track with a utility as well as an EQ8, and this is just going to save me from having to add these effects later on. Once you've got all the effects that you find yourself using most on the track, you can right click on the track and you can come down to Set as Default MIDI Track. So now every time you add a new MIDI track, you're automatically going to have these effects applied to it, and it's going to save you tons of time in the long run. Now one thing that totally changed the game for me is the fact that Ableton allows you to make your own shortcuts using your PC keyboard as well as your MIDI controller. So if you come over to the top right hand corner, you're going to see these two buttons, one that says key and one that says MIDI. Clicking on these is going to bring up the mapping editor where you can assign keys from your keyboard or your MIDI controller to do certain tasks inside of Ableton. If you're using a MIDI controller, then it's pretty cool because you can assign the sliders and knobs on your keyboard to some of the parameters within Ableton itself. So I don't really have anything mapped to my MIDI controller, however I do have some assigned to my computer keyboard. So these are the shortcuts that I find are the easiest for me to use. I like to have the star key linked to record. I like to have the number 0 on my numpad linked to stop. Number 1 is linked to the metronome on or off button, and number 2 is linked to the loop on or off button. These are just the shortcuts that I find the easiest for me, and you can pretty much map anything with this method. The next tip I'm going to show you is an easy little workaround for strumming chords inside of Ableton. One of the things that I really like about FL Studio is the fact that you can strum your chords just by using one simple shortcut. So what I'm about to show you is a sort of similar workaround for Ableton Live users. So the first thing you want to do is come in and load an arpeggiator onto your MIDI track. Then the next thing you want to do is grab the note length plugin. Now you can just grab both of these plugins and press Ctrl and G to add them to a MIDI effect rack. From here you just want to go into your arpeggiator and set this repeats function to 1. Next I'm coming up to the rate in the arpeggiator and I'm just going to map this to macro 1. Then I'm going to take the length setting from my note length plugin and map that to macro 2. Then I'll just come over here and hit this minus until it's only those two macros that are visible. Just to make things a bit more clear, I'm just going to rename this first one to speed. and I'll rename the second one to length. I find the faster you have it, the more realistic it's going to sound. What you can then do is use automation, and you can use this to control the speed, which is going to make it sound a bit more realistic. So moving on, I'm going to go over some arrangement and organization tips to close out the video. So this loop section in Ableton is actually probably a lot more useful than you thought it was. I actually use this loop section to do much more than just regular looping of my sounds. One thing I use this loop section for is to select certain parts of a track to move out to a different area. So before I knew this tip, if I wanted to move a whole section of a track, I'd usually go in and highlight the whole thing and then move it manually like this. However, with the looping section, all you need to do is hover over the area that you want to copy, then hit this gray area, and that's automatically going to highlight everything for you. And from there, you can move this around to wherever you want. And this is actually going to work in reverse too. So if there's an area of the track that you want to remove, but you don't want to leave a gap, then you could just move this loop region to the area that you want to delete. Then from here, you can press Control, Shift, and Delete. And this is going to delete that part of the track, and it's also going to nudge everything after backwards. So sometimes when you're moving clips from one track to another, you can often mess up the color coding in the process. So one quick way to fix this is to come over to the affected track, right click on it, and then you can hit Assign Track Color to Clips. I myself find this one very useful because I am a bit OCD when it comes to the color of my tracks and clips. And yeah, that's pretty much it really. These are all the tips that changed the way that I work in Ableton Live and allowed me to really speed up my workflow. If there's any tips or tricks that I didn't mention in this video, then make sure to leave them in the comments and I'll check them all out and might even include them in a follow-up video. If you learned anything new from this video, then make sure to smash the thumbs up before you leave. And if you're new to the channel, then make sure that subscribe button's grey. Big shout out to anybody that made it all the way to the end of the video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.